All right, our next speaker is Philippe Gagnon. He's a research professor for the Chair of Science, Technoscience, and Faith in the Age of Integral Ecology, and is attached to the Ethics Laboratory at Lille Catholic University. He is a fellow of ISSR and has been a member of the European Society for the Study of Science and Theology since 2001. He is a member of the European Society for Process Thought and took part in the recent 7th European Summer School in Process Thought, where he gave a paper on Whitehead's The Function of Reason. As scientific director of the Vial Whitehead Archive Fund at the Lille Catholic Institute, he acts as an advisor to process researchers, and his presentation today is entitled Assessing Whitehead's Biological Turn.
Thank you, Joe. Let me try to share screen.
Yes, we see it.
You can see it. Okay, good. The in front of my eyes that I'm trying to move. As I can hardly read. Oh, maybe if I do this. So, in the paper by Dennis Doge, Whitehead at Harvard, 1994-95, so the so-called HL1, statements to the effect that fitness would concern the cosmos as a whole. And we also find the idea that the environment is to be considered, and not only an isolated organism or a category that would contain the idea of the living, and that this also means that there's to be an internalization, so to speak, of the environment. And we read as well about biology contributing to the science of physics, and we can witness a call to a unified cosmological perspective. All things that I find quite good, and it was useful to read this paper. But when I first saw it in the table of content, before I got the book to be bought by my university library and then by myself for my personal bookcases, I was still struck by the title of a biological turn in Whitehead. And I think that what Paul Bogart said right before is kind of a launching ground for some of the ideas I want to share. So Searle also shares a quote from the Harvard Lectures 1 of Whitehead saying that in the new outlook that he's developing, the key is going to be the environment. But his judgment in conclusion is that even the privileged commentators such as Dorothy Emmett, when she considers that he did not accomplish the transition to biology with his concept of organism, didn't quite fit it in the categories of that one would expect from such a word as organism, and that he speaks about the organism as atomic. So the author of the chapter, Searle, considers that she would have judged that he dismissed or misunderstood the new data. And this is where my contribution wants to come in, because I squarely disagree with the fact that Emmett should have known more and revised what she said about this. It seems to me there is this ambiguity in Whitehead's notion of the organism. From the very moment I started to read him, I could not put that away. And it does not have the vitalistic sense of Diderot Bruyère, about whom I wrote the doctorate, and I will mention later, or Deleuze. So I offer your commentary on a transition, I guess you could say, that should take place between the HL1 and HL2, if there was anything real in the purported biological turn. And the fact of the matter is that should one read HL2 with an eye to considerable elaborations about biology, one is not at all going to find them. That was mentioned before as well. So what Whitehead says about it is circumscribed to discussion of the unwelcome influence of ancient morphological thinking, and a plea to develop a functional understanding which would deal with the relationship between energy and integration. It's about energy and form. The idea is that Whitehead seems to revise the ancient notion of forms, replacing successively other forms, with the tie of these instances residing in some entelikeia, which would be best rendered as residing in its end. whereas energy would mean in the midst of or being at work. And these captured the act of Aristotle that was rendered in Latin as actus, and would have been better left off as energy, less misleading than act. Heidegger is on record for saying that translating this energeia as act, actus, one had in one fell swoop liquidated the Greek world. The clearest statement of the matters we're getting into is in HL2, these pages I referenced here. In Roetlisberger's entry for November 10, 1925, the morphological and the functional are distinguished. In that same note, Taker's entry for November 12, the time depth expression into Zen, which is summarized as a denial that you could describe the ultimate entity by pointing to shape. So we need, beyond that, a synthesis, apprehension, and something that could embrace all time. This suggests, to me at least, a high degree of consistency on the part of Whitehead, in that for him, the supreme principle is the universal attraction exerted on all actual occasions by the rest of the universe. And in fact, if we look carefully at HL1, the last dissertation of Whitehead on James Clerk Maxwell in the electromagnetic theory can somehow, in some of its aspects, be reconstructed. So we have the presence in Whitehead of a perpetual perishing, and we get to this problem: how can things last as they come to be for an infinitesimal instant and then are not? Whitehead offers a universal solidarity construal by emphasizing prehension and passing on of occasions in a lift toward the superject, the subject considered with its antecedent conditions, and not just some transcendental falling from heaven autonomous entity. So this is the background. In so doing, Whitehead points to a theory of satisfaction of actual entities and subsumes the worth of those entities in a fulfillment of divine consequent nature. I wrote a good 2 pages of this in the paper. As you understood, I did not say it, I should have. I preferred, instead of reading a paper, to pass on the ideas, perhaps not in the same order, through slides that are, I guess it reads better and summarizes better. So Whitehead posits a pan-experientialism. And what connects all experiences and occasions of experience is feeling, a term that is connoted in a sophisticated way in his writings, in particular in PR. One would have to crack open that term before one uttered criticism of Whitehead's systems or proposals. And the task is not easy. I, in the paper one more time, suggest ways that feeling can be inflexed, and I borrow a graph from Donald Gelpies to suggest the inherent complexity of this idea. Whitehead makes no mystery of his criticism of a physics which furthers the bifurcation of nature. And that being so, one could hypothesize a tiered system of science where you need this fundamental layer that makes possible an emergence of the biological, the psychological. And this kind of image was presupposed by everyone, be it Auguste de Comte or Carnap in his logical reconstruction of the world through syntax and language. But if this was really so, if you add to, like an onion, build up layers, one would make Whitehead's construction to a dismissal of physics and a turn to biology to give significance to the cosmos. Why not settle for what controls more in this ascending ladder, even if it is going to be ontologically more dependent? And so I was led to explore other ways, in particular to this work on Raymond Ruyère, which I guess in the United States or the Anglo-Saxon world you would know less, but his major works have been a few major works have been now translated. 2 things came to mind, therefore, in this possibility. The spiral system of science, which was presented by Jean-Louis Lemoyne, a French exponent of the sciences of complexity and systems theorist. In this model, the sciences constantly refer to each other, but none dominates. And I refer to the Les Épistémologies Constructivistes, which I think has had last year's 6th edition. And then Raymond Rouillet's criticism of Nikolai Hartmann's view of superposed realms in his masterpiece, Néo-Finalisme, which now is in a good English translation published by the University of Minnesota Press, Neo-Finalism. And here the viewpoint that matters is not a detached, almost contemplative one, but a situation of the knower in the middle of everything. In other words, one would have to build a framework for the sciences to integrate the knowing subject. Now, for an objectivist and still neo-positivism inspired epistemology, Rouillet would commit the fatal sin, since he would ask that we start by what we perceive and what we experience, instead of denying it in the name of ghostly, generalized universal ringing laws. He will use analogy to transfer this to what's out there. So Rouillet builds a lot around seeing it once. So epistemology, the part of his epistemology that's most developed is examples having to do with vision, seeing, a capacity of the knower to know and to go beyond parts external to other parts to grasp as once, at once. Whitehead, having spent a lot of time reading and commenting poetry, and it's among his favorite examples, captures this wholeness in a different way, the idea of feeling that I've already alluded to. So it seems that unless the expression be really dialecticized and highly qualified, talks of a biological turn in Whitehead risks leading the mind in the wrong direction, in my opinion. Because as said, Whitehead's system, which is a revisable, fallible metaphysics, something in its own quite remarkable, and I can't develop here for want of time, but Whitehead is aiming at divine completion. His focus, therefore, is not, if you want to put it this way, telluric or herd-centered. And for someone doing a cosmology, we can't rule out an inspiration taken from biology. We've heard of, astrobiology. Yet the insight classically was conveyed much more through the physico-theological argument, as it was called, for the world's orderliness pointing toward God. The biology, if that's even a category for what he did, that we find in Lawrence Anderson, is called in as an argument for Whitehead turning to biology in the chapter that I'm commenting on. Yet, when one looks carefully, one finds that Henderson is reinserting the question of biology in a cosmic context. He's part of the cosmic physicist from whom he draws inspiration. For instance, he cites an article that has this title from the great Swedish chemist Arrhenius, saying that cosmic physics was movement at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. It is tempting to inflate the wording we use and call this meditation of cosmic order biology, and that it would have superseded a cosmic physics that we do not practice anymore. But Anderson's reasoning, I spent quite a bit of time going back on this as I'd read through the years. His reasonings of something abductive to them. They are generalizing the fitness idea to the environment, as in the very title of the work. And this gets done by a recurrence from contingent earth conditions to larger set where one could insert them. And this is, for having spent years in a biology interest group when I was teaching in Minnesota, because I taught about 10 years in the United States, this is not how biologists reason. In a conference in Lyon that I contributed to organizing, and which had a theological dimension, given that we had the nerves to speak of cosmic fraternity, we were on a chair of science and religion, where I was a research fellow before, we were told by environmentalists that the cosmos wasn't the question. And so, yet Anderson does not reason like fine-tuning theorists, with whom he's sometimes compared as some precursor. the contingency of the order he finds never escapes his mind, and the necessity he finds is a necessity that I would call conditional. So in order to think this through, it helped for me, and I share it with you, and I don't know if the illumination is similar, but Antoine Augustin Cournot, a French statesman, but mathematician and one of the inventors of probability reasoning, who meditated at length on finality in nature, especially in his Traité de l'enchaînement des idées fondamentales dans les sciences et dans l'histoire. In my paper, you have the title at length, made this distinction that seems crucial. Those who dismiss natural finality, in other words, instinct typified finality, do it in terms that criticize, in fact, a finality that would get its final end stage preset from the start. Bergson criticized finalism in those words, for instance, but it is not so. Finality in nature has adapted itself to antecedent.
Philippe, did we lose you? I think Philippe's connection might have been cut. Oh, are you there, Philippe? Oh, you're muted. Try that.
I just unmuted.
There you go.
Let's keep going. I'll continue where I was.
You've got about 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Joe. So back to what I was saying about Cournot. Rational finality indeed makes the getting to the end stage the mere running of a tape, if you want to put it this way. A distinction of this kind has been missed, blurred, for instance, by intelligent design theorists. So another dilemma was helpful for me. Father Dominique Duval, in his UNESCO colloquium that celebrated 10 years of the death of both Einstein and Teilhard de Chardin, because they died the same year, first talks about Einstein's and Spinoza's, if you want to put it that way, universe captured, and it swept all. It seemed to be awesome, right? We're awestruck. Duval lists impressive features of such a universe. But then this grand idealization, continuing that of Galileo, has its limits. We have an irreversible universe, and the energy budgets don't run as they would in classical physics. The suggestion drawn from this is that it might very well be Teilhard's vision, which is compatible with a quantum vision of the universe and which is closer to the truth. So he suggests. And one thing that's striking is that confronted to life emerging from something that could only be apprehended as mechanical, think of celestial mechanics, remember these layers I presented, Teilhard's reaction in a passage from his masterpiece, The Phenomenon of Man, that I reference in the paper, is to posit a life layer, so to speak, under this mechanical one, making determinism only be an appearance. And what struck me is that Whitehead does not use a similar strategy. Whitehead will not keep in the cuff of his shirt a vitalist strategy. In HL2, his insistence goes to inquiring about pan experience, the living would undergo and feel in the properly Whiteheadian center and depth that we've mentioned. And so another problem is those referencing the book Everything Flows from OUP in 2018. There's no converging trend of that sort on a process philosophizing in biology. It could be said to exist in some circles, certainly, but there's no overall such orientation. So what's correct in the end, as I read this chapter, I don't want to be polemicizing on the cheap or because the chapter is quite interesting, but it's quite right to state that the process vision of biology would question the explanatory prevalence and the power of ideas such as the gene, always right? The molecule, the cell. It would remind us that these cut from their environment would not produce life as we know it. And many high schoolers still hear that with the cell, you have everything. You just, need to put a few trillions and you get an organism. But what we need to receive with caution, I suggest, is that Whitehead seems to continue, even as he philosophizes on biology, what can only be regarded as a generalized physics, in my opinion. Rejecting the morphological view in HL2, I had a few slides about that. As we saw the idea of entelechyia, inhabitation in its end, it seems to me we cannot pull Whitehead in the direction of some neo-Aristotelianism. When I mentioned Bruyère, who I sometimes present as the French Whitehead, well, he was labeled as such by an important biophilosopher, Canguilhem, in a critical notice from the Revue de Métaphysique et de Morale in 1947.
Philippe, we're just
And
to let
such
you know
a generalized
at time. So just to give you a time check, would love to transition to Q&A as soon as possible.
Yes, I will do it rapidly. So if you will allow me one more slide. So such a generalized physics is something a classical tradition upheld, which tradition meditated on Plato's Timaeus. And we see Whitehead doing just that in Adventures of Ideas and Arity and Process and Reality. So therefore, if my judgment is sound, when we stumble on concepts such as time and depth at the bottom of Whitehead's effort, we should not be too eager to claim that his take would be a flipping of position toward a specialness of life in the cosmos. The problem is complex. It would involve a theory of mereological descriptions that I intend to work on for my French habilitation in a few years ahead, that would allow itself to revisit Aristotle's initial distinctions between the heap and the truly unified form. Those, it seems to me, would vindicate the Platonic character of many of Whitehead's proposals. So Whitehead's statements about forms being pertinent for the analysis of even mundane material examples is another thing that I deduced here in the end, that suggested to me that this take on form resembles Plato's Aidoi or even ideas in Malebranche, and that they are aiming at a universalization and not at a special pleading for the presence of biology in the cosmos. I will omit the last slide and obey, just leave to Brian the prompt.
Thank
you very much.
Very much. Thank you. That's all. Thank Philippe for what excellent papers we're having today. There's some chat in the comments in the chat. I realized that I probably should have been more precise in suggesting that if you had a question you'd like me to pose, go ahead and just put question and then write something. And if you're just making comments, then I'll just assume that they're just side conversations along the way in the chat. But if you did want me to read a question, pose a question to the speaker, just put question and then say your question in the chat. So anybody interested in, and in fact, I'd probably maybe first look at Paul just in case he wants to jump in since this is so close to his work, but anybody like to jump in? And Philippe, if you could stop sharing, then we can make the
oh yes, of course I can stop sharing. Yeah,
perfect. So who would like to jump in? We've got about 5 or 6 minutes here for good discussion.
I mean, I guess one point that's pretty evident to see, Paul Bogart mentioned it, is that if you add a biological turn and the organism is biologically understood, which is much more in the shadow of a neo-mechanicized philosophy, as far as I've understood in these biological, discussion, biology interest group discussions. If you had that, then Whitehead would have had to undergo a different turn or to go 360 degrees because it's not present in HL2 for the lectures for 25.6 and 26.7.
Farzad, please.
Hi, I really enjoyed the presentation, and in that spirit, I really picked up on your comparing it to Whitehead to cosmic physics. And if you do that, sort of generalizing physics, which is what he wanted to do to keep it from being bifurcational, then biology becomes a category mistake in a sense. That's the sense I get from what you're saying. It's enough to just improve physics, and you're there. You're done. So to kind of go down to present day biology, which restricts its domain, like the ecologist you mentioned, restricting their domain, then you never get to where you're going. There's a disconnect there somewhere. So,
Well, I mean, it's in the paper I reference Claire Palmer's work. I thought that I know Brian discussed that too at some point through articles, but the first, let's say, 20 pages of her book on process thought and environmental philosophy, I think that the insight is formidable. It's a real challenge to process thinking beyond about earthly environmental ethics. The perspective is satisfaction and completion, so to speak, of divine nature and the consequent nature, and so the focus is cosmic. And I was struck by these stars of biology and environmental studies in France who attended our conference, who had no interest, no regard for anything cosmic. And so I think, thank you for highlighting it, because that's in the line of what I wanted to at least put on the table for discussion for further clarification.
thank you.
The risk, of course, with Palmer's suggestion, in fact, it's meant to be a criticism from her, right, is that it's a totalizing consequentialism that,
right.
And so I suggest in my responses to her work that it's not clear to me that it's supportable by Whitehead's work, but it is probably by Hartshorne's. Hartshorne arguably has a form of contributionism, wherein everything's value is ultimately about its contribution to the divine life. Dan Dabrowski, who's here with us, has suggested that there are ways of mitigating that or contextualizing that. But I think I take your point about sort of cosmic as being overall welcome. I just don't know that you'd want to or need to overemphasize it, right? Because everything has value for itself, for others, and for the whole. And so you don't want to lose the whole, but you also have no reason to avoid recognizing and emphasizing the value of the individual and the whole and others. So Maria, would you like to jump in? Let me see if I can spotlight you.
Just very quickly, thank you very much for the paper. I was pretty curious about Canguilhem that you mentioned at some point, because I'm sorry, I didn't have the time to read your paper. So maybe you mentioned it also in the paper, but can you say a few words more about Canguilhem and Whitehead, if there are some historical connection or if there are some studies on them?
Well, Canguilhem I mentioned because he wrote this note on the situation of biological philosophy in France in 1947. And what happened with Ruyer, and I was not sure if I should put Ruyer in here because who has read him? Although now in English, there's excellent translations of The Genesis of Living Forms, Neo-Finalism, etc. But what he understood in Ruyer's idea, which is fundamentally that there are primary consciousnesses, if that's good English, and secondary ones such as our reflexive ones. And so Ruyer has a form of panpsychism that is probably more directly a panpsychism than that of Whitehead. Whitehead is a reluctant panpsychist. He never wants to go 100% in that direction. But the presence of Canguilhem here was just that he validated the connection between Ruyer's position and the Neo-Aristotelianism. That's a hunch, it's a judgment by an extremely able, biological philosopher. I'm not sure it's entirely correct because Ruyer is allergic to substantial forms as much as Whitehead could be said to be. And the rest we would need more time to elaborate, but it's an invitation to you all that at least to know that there's such a thing as a French Whitehead, and that now he can be read in English, at least his masterpiece. So that's already huge.